Open source software is growing like wildfire and it's taken over the world. But just like the invention of fire itself, for all its goodness, open source does have a dangerous side. And if you don't understand that, you could get burned. Welcome to IPY. If you thought IP and open source were totally different things, then I'm glad you're here.
Why is an IP series talking about open source? And what's with the egg?
Because the story of open source actually begins with copyright. That's because by default, all software is protected by copyright immediately upon creation, because the law assumes that the creator should have a say in how the software is used. Copyright provides protection against copying, but only literal copying, like copy and paste, but not copying through reverse engineering. But if your code is protected behind a firewall, people can't access it to copy and paste anyway. So protecting proprietary software today usually means keeping it secret or patenting it or both. Copyright law assumes that you don't want people to use your code. But if you do, then you need to give them a clear permission to use or copy or distribute or whatever. That's called a license. And when you install software and you click I accept, you're accepting the software license. But if you want to open source your code, just publishing it on a Git repository won't do it, because you still need to give users permission with an open source license. Today there's standardized licenses for most open source projects. MIT, Apache, GPL, these are among the most popular licenses, and there's others. So let's review. Open source code is still copyrighted. It's still owned by its owner, and you only get rights to use it because of the license. When you're using open source, following some basic rules can help you avoid getting burned.
I thought open source was free of rules. Isn't that the whole point?
Some say open source is free like a puppy is free, because there's hidden costs and pitfalls to understand before you adopt. For example, all open source licenses are not the same. Generally, there's two categories of open source licenses: permissive and restrictive. Permissive licenses don't have many conditions. They're just more permissive. But restrictive licenses, also called copyleft licenses, can create serious risk for your business. Some actually force you to open source your code even if you didn't want to. Choosing the wrong kind of open source for your business could be devastating, especially if your sites are set on a successful exit someday. Because buyers always check to see how you used open source. And if you don't do that properly, it can seriously devalue your business or even kill the deal. Years ago, Cisco acquired the networking company Linksys, but they eventually discovered that Linksys had used open source software that required Linksys software to also be released as open source. So Cisco lost the ability to generate revenue from that Linksys software. Buyers have learned their lessons since then and are now very careful about open source risks in acquisitions. Open source licenses are not difficult to obey if you're organized. You just need to understand which open source licenses align with your business objectives, only use codes with those licenses, and keep a log of what you use and where. To cut to the chase, the permissive licenses like MIT and Apache are the easiest to manage. And if you want to keep your software proprietary, avoid the restrictively licensed codes. Unless you understand and manage your open source licenses, you really are playing with fire. Sharing your work with the world can be exciting, but it could also mean a bunch of legal things you didn't know you had to worry about. Essentially, it means you're giving up some of your IP rights to achieve a business goal, and that's okay. They're your rights after all. But once you do give them up, you can't get them back, so it's not a decision to take lightly. Open source is just another tool to help you accomplish business objectives. Maybe you want to create demand for your platform, or generate publicity, or build a community to help improve your code. But just releasing open source doesn't magically do any of that. You have to dedicate time, energy, and money to maintain and develop the code. There are upsides and downsides, so it has to fit with your goals. But if you don't know what your goals are, how can you achieve them? You need a strategy to define how the open source will support your business goals. Just like I've talked about the strategy that you need for protecting your secrets or patenting. In fact, open source is also part of your IP strategy roadmap plan. And by the way, releasing open source does not mean that you have to give up all of your IP rights. More on this in a second. Let's consider two possible business scenarios. In the first scenario, the code that you want to open source isn't core to your business or a key competitive differentiator. Maybe it's just a tool developed to solve some internal problem. And that's a common pattern for startups. Sometimes the project will gain a life of its own and maybe even create a future business opportunity. But because it's not core or a competitive differentiator, it's not a life or death decision for your company. But in the second scenario, where the code is core to your business or is a key competitive differentiator, the decision can have serious side effects. And that raises two important questions. The first, if you're giving away your core software, how are you going to get paid? There are business models such as pay for support like Red Hat, or an open core model where the proprietary code is layered on top of the open source like Spark and Databricks. And there's software as a service or SaaS models built around open source like Cloudify. But you need a strategy that makes sense on how you're going to get paid. The second question is, if you're giving away your key differentiator, then what's your competitive moat? If others can do the same thing, how are you going to differentiate yourself? The fact is, if you're doing something unique that no one else is doing, then open sourcing that may not help your business at all. But a hybrid approach of releasing open source and protecting IP could be a good option. It's true, releasing open source doesn't have to be an either-or decision. You can support an open source project and still maintain some IP rights. One common strategy is to open source a base version and then monetize a proprietary enterprise or enhanced version that you protect as a secret. You can even file a patent to protect the functional aspects of your open source code. In fact, open source software is often patented, and that's why most common open source licenses also include a patent license. Red Hat has over 3,000 patents covering its open source software. With a hybrid approach and IP tools like secrets and patents, you can enhance your competitive moat while at the same time achieving your open source objectives. Check out my other IPY videos for more on how secrets and patents can help AI and software startups. There are open source options for data structures, and even patents. And for the most part, these work like open source software, but never assume anything.
You know what they say about people who assume.
If you're not careful, you could get burned by the license terms. So it turns out that open source and copyright are closer than you thought. And open source may be a little more complicated than it first appeared. But if you treat open source and its obligations with a little respect, you can harness that awesome power without getting burned. And don't forget, check out all the great resources on the IPY website. In the next video, we're going to see how contracts can be powerful IP tools.